Whenever I do metalwork in my other shop, I end up with such a dirty mess on my workbench. So I want to make a separate metalworking bench on wheels, and I've got some heavy-duty casters for this purpose, and I'll make it the way I make most of my cabinets, with a box joint 2x4 frame that leaves maximum opening on the front, but is still rigid against side-to-side movement, and then a 2x4 joining that to the back. Except this workbench will be more than twice as wide. So here's my sophisticated model, and I worked out one 2x4 will be long enough for one of these, plus one of these, plus one of these. Got my lumber cut. Now I need to cut box joints into the ends of these pieces and these pieces. I'm putting in 2 saw blades so that I can cut a thicker kerf and hog those joints out faster. Okay, got the jig set up, and I've got 4 2x4s in there to cut all at once. So it turns out cutting that much stock all at once makes the blades a little bit squished together, so I'll make the second cut a little bit further along, and that way the mating joints will have wider slots and narrower fingers. Well, I did screw up a little bit. For long pieces I have these symmetrical, so I start with a space on this side here, and on the far end I'm also starting with a space on here. But for the short pieces I've got the space here, but then on the other end I've got it here. So now I have to cut the rest of them the same way and then remember to orient it all right when I assembled it. These mistakes really make a project complicated. Now this part goes in the middle here, and I can join it in there by cutting a series of slot mortises in there, except I don't want to cut away half the material, so I'll cut away half of the fingers here. So I carefully marked where the slots actually need to go, and to get the spacing for them just right, I'm using a counter wheel up here, which counts how many turns of a 16 turns per inch threaded rod I'm turning. And since I know these are all at half-inch spacing, I just have to make sure that numbers on here are multiples of 8, which corresponds to half inches. Got most of the frame dry fit now, and to avoid further assembly mistakes, I actually labeled every joint, so I'll put it together the same way. And now to join the front and back frames, I'm going to have a whole lot of these pieces, and I'm going to join those in actually using floating tenons. So with floating tenons, a mortise gets cut into the end of a piece of wood so that a tenon can fit into it like this. The advantage can be sometimes it's easier to cut another mortise and make a floating tenon than it is to cut a tenon into the end of the wood. Now I need to cut corresponding mortises here and here. So the reason I'm now doing a series of plunge cuts is because it's always easier to remove chips from the side of the piece of wood, and so by making a plunge cut I'm drilling into the end and making side cuts, whereas when I was making the cuts in the end of the piece of wood I didn't want to plunge cut because cutting out from the face is very difficult, but by sweeping side to side I was essentially making side grain cuts. I'm sometimes asked about the advantages of floating tenons versus integral tenons. Well, in this case here, the floating tenon actually has a strength advantage because I didn't want to make the mortise any bigger because I didn't want to cut away too much of this wood, and this being made out of maple, it's stronger than the spruce that the rest of the piece of wood is made out of. But if the piece going in here was actually only this size, then an integral tenon would actually be advantageous because it would be stronger, because a floating tenon like this leaves way too little material and it's just doesn't have enough hold. For now, some of the joints are just dry fitted, but it's still plenty sturdy. Gluing up this workbench frame is actually pretty tricky, so I'm doing it in stages. So this frame on the bottom is actually the front frame, and I've glued all the mortise and tenon joints into that one. But for the back frame, for the time being, they're just dry fitted to make sure the parts actually line up. Well, that went together better than expected. I guess it helps to have a bigger persuader. I also made some drawers for this workbench, which I'll cover in my next video. So the idea is when it's not winter, I can just wheel it outside and do my welding and plasma cutting there.